Hi, everyone. It's Christy Patriarcha from Teacher to Teacher Help. And today I'm going to be sharing with you tips for creating pre-recorded mini lessons for asynchronous learning, or what we might call flipped lessons. So before I dive into sharing some tips that I've put together for you today, let's first think about why we would want to create flipped or pre-recorded lessons in the first place. So as we're creating these flipped lessons, we would want to create like a menu or a place where we're housing these lessons for students to be able to access. And when students have access to the learning in which they're doing, we know that it's going to build both independence and agency over their work. And it's also going to increase student motivation and engagement because they have that ownership. In addition to that, flipped or pre-recorded lessons also give students an opportunity to watch and re-watch that teaching. So because they can control the pace of the lesson itself by pausing or by rewinding and re-watching certain parts, students are able to take in more of that learning. And I think that's really powerful because I know anytime that I'm learning something new, I do like to hear it and I do like to see it a couple of different times. Along with that, we can think about how flipped or pre-recorded lessons can help us with differentiated instruction, right? So whether that is intervention or enrichment, for students who might need to have access to that teaching more than one time, we may even take some of our learners and show them a flipped lesson prior to the lesson that takes place face-to-face in the classroom. Or they may have an opportunity to watch or re-watch that learning when it's specifically applicable to them in their learning progression. Additionally, for enrichment, we may have some flipped lessons that extend the learning so that students who are along further on that progression can access some learning that stretches them. Going along with that, flipped lessons are also great for conferring in small groups. So when we have a collection of teaching and we come alongside a reader or writer and we notice what they're ready for next, we can queue up one of our flipped lessons for students to view and see a really thorough demonstration of what that teaching tip or technique looks like. So I kind of like to think of this as an opportunity where I could create a digital toolkit. And as I notice patterns of needs for my students in the classroom and things that they're ready for next, I may then start to pull small groups around those videos and those lessons as well. This can take place both face-to-face and remotely. I also like to think about how my feedback for students can be differentiated, and I can have a conference in a form of an asynchronous response. So whether I'm using a digital platform like Seesaw or Flipgrid, or maybe I'm just giving feedback in like a Google Doc, I can link specific teaching to the feedback I'm giving. So for example, if I say, remember, one way that we can bring our characters to life is by adding action and dialogue, I can then link my pre-recorded lesson right in there for students to be able to view demonstration of that work being done. Another nice thing about flipped lessons is they work really well for substitute teachers. So if you know that you might be out or maybe in a time where things are uncertain and we don't know what our absences might look like, flipped lessons are a great way for substitute teachers to come in and to be able to carry on and continue that learning because you have that collection of lessons there for them to utilize. And last but not least, and I don't have this here, but I think that one of the biggest selling points right now when we don't know, are we going to be face-to-face? Are we going to be remote? Are we going to be maybe a little bit of both in a hybrid version? And maybe we're a little bit of all of those throughout the school year. Flipped lessons work beautifully in all of those settings. So rather than thinking about switching my teaching around, I can really focus on getting really good at creating pre-recorded and flipped lessons so that I get more bang for my buck in my teaching and helping students reach those learning outcomes. And I become much more efficient on the planning and prep end, and I have more time then to work with my actual students. Okay, so the first step in thinking about creating flipped lessons or pre-recorded lessons is thinking about how this looks similar to and a little bit different from a typical architecture of a mini lesson. So we're going to want to think about some shifts in the architecture, and we're also going to want to think about some shifts in pacing. So in a typical face-to-face mini lesson, we have our connection where we connect with our students from previous day learning. We might have some analogies there that's going to lead students into the teaching point. And in the teaching point we're going to have today, I want to teach you, and we're going to tell them that thing that it is that we're going to teach them and why it's important and how it's done. And then in a typical mini lesson we teach, we demonstrate that, or we might show an example and we're like, watch me, let me show you. And after we demonstrate it or give that example, we give students time to practice. And we call that our active engagement. We're like, okay, you give it a try. And then they go ahead and they spend, 3 to 5 minutes giving that a go as you're kind of circling around in that group and you're giving them some feedback. And then last but not least, we link it off and we're like, okay, we provide a couple of examples to reinforce that teaching point that we heard from the active engagement. And then we're like, today and every day when you want to, and then we name that teaching point again to remind them that this is a technique or strategy that's transferable. It's not just something we're doing today. It's something that we can add to our toolbox as readers and writers that we can do when appropriate. So a typical, mini lesson, we want to keep at our lower primary levels, our mini lessons should be somewhere around maybe 7 minutes. And as we move up into the intermediate and the middle grades, we might find that mini lessons sit somewhere more around 10 to 12 minutes. But there's some shifts then when we think about flipped lessons or pre-recorded lessons. So the first shift is in that pacing. When we're talking about our youngest learners, we want our flipped lessons to maybe be 4 or 5 minutes. So I try to shoot for about that range. And for our intermediate and middle grade students, we might want to think about these mini lessons being somewhere more around, 8 to 10 minutes. So the pace, the amount of time that the lesson takes overall is going to be shorter in the flipped pre-recorded lesson. When we talk about the architecture, the session will start just the same with the connection. But I find that the connection in the virtual mini lessons is going to be much quicker. And you're going to find that it's just going to say like, oh, hi writers, hi readers, like we've been working on. And then I usually dive right into that teaching point. Or I might review over the anchor chart really quickly, but I make this part much shorter in my recordings than I do when I'm in face-to-face. And it's one way that I can save time. The teaching point I keep exactly the same. I name that teaching point. I give the why, I give the how. And I go into my first teach number 1, and I demonstrate that just like I would in the face-to-face, but I'm doing this in the recording. Then there comes a change. Instead of the active engagement, I have started to take what the students would have done in that active engagement and I teach it again. So I'm like, okay, let me try this again. Or will you try this with me? And then I demonstrate it or model it another time so that the students aren't just seeing it one time. They're seeing this technique or strategy 2 different times, which I think is really important, especially when we have that recorded setting. And then last but not least, I then link it off. So again, much like the link over here, using that transferable language of like today and every day and naming that strategy or that tip that students can take with them as readers or writers. The main difference here in the link is that I often then will ask students to go off and try this work, and I'll tell them where. So I'll need to be thinking about the digital platform that I want them to go ahead and try this work in, and also where they might have an opportunity to show what they've done or show their thinking. So I might use something like Google Classroom or Flipgrid or Seesaw or whatever it is. That's not so important as long as it meets the goals that you have for what students are doing. Now, one other thing to say about this, some teachers have taken the mini lessons and they have places where they pause along the way, and they'll say, maybe they do the teach and then they might pause and ask students, okay, go ahead and pause it now and give this a try. And that's certainly something that you can do. I personally found that just running through the mini lesson and showing 2 demonstrations or 2 examples. And then when I link it off, asking students to go ahead and try that work, that seemed to work really well for me. So just some shifts in architecture that you might consider, and then thinking about how the overall pace of the mini lesson and the recorded sessions is going to be shorter. So we've talked about the why behind why we might want to create pre-recorded or flipped lessons. And then we also just talked about some of the architectural and pacing shifts from face-to-face mini lessons to pre-recorded mini lessons. So I want to share with you now how I found some strategies and techniques that seem to work really well for me to efficiently create these mini lessons so that it didn't become like my whole life. I first want to tell you that when I launched into doing this work, I was thinking of it a lot like face-to-face teaching because, that's what I knew. And so I would prep a lesson and then I would teach a lesson and prep a lesson and teach a lesson. And I learned a couple of things from that. One, in pre-recorded mini lessons, the majority of the work is in the prep, right? So I felt like that was a little bit different than in face-to-face, where I could look at my instruction, know what I was going to do, but I felt like the majority of the work was in the face-to-face session itself. But in pre-recorded, because of the nature of being recorded, you've got to have everything set up and everything has to be ready. So I found that the prep took significantly more time for the recorded sessions. Another thing that I realized was that this kind of like prep, record was just throwing my sync off. Like I would finally, I would do the recording and then I was like, okay, now I'm going back to prepping. And so what I tried that I found to be really effective was that I would do just a bunch of mini lesson preps at once. And then I would do a bunch of recordings all at once. So I do one recording after another. Now I will say I did then kind of treat this like a dressing room. Like in between, I would go and I would change, like at the very least, my top. So it looked like I was changing my clothes from day to day because I didn't want to look like, oh, Miss Patriarca wears the same thing every time she's teaching. So as I started to do that, I came up with a system in my prep that I found to be really helpful. I created a template that just had boxes on it for the things that I wanted to make sure that I was saying or sharing in my mini lesson. And because of the nature of that mini lesson, again, being recorded, I want it to be all on one page so that I didn't have to be trying to flip through anything, that I could see everything that I needed to say or that I wanted to remember right on that one page. And I would put that right in front of my laptop and where I was being recorded. And what I included on the template was just some of that main mini lesson language that I knew I wanted to make sure was included, that I didn't want to have to rewrite and repeat. So I just kind of left those little sentence stems in there to help me as I was thinking about the things that I wanted to include. And so I would just keep these really brief, review the anchor chart, and then I would write out the teaching point in the verbiage that I wanted it to be said in. I was really specific about that. Then in my teaching method 1, I would just be okay, show it on that page, in teaching method 2, okay, and then show it on, page 6, show it again on page 6. And on that part, I made sure that if there were any kinds of Post-its or anything that I needed to add, I included those in my boxes. For example, this is an anchor chart for avid readers. And this could be an anchor chart for anything, but this just happens to be one for avid readers. And so if I was adding, this Post-it to the anchor chart, maybe in the connection or in the teaching point, I would put that Post-it there in the box as well. So I just had it handy and I could put it right on that anchor chart. Similarly, when I would be teaching and say I was teaching, out of a book like this, and I knew that I was going to be doing some demonstration on a particular page, if part of my lesson was to be adding these Post-its, and this was part of my teach, I would have then these Post-its here in that box so that, again, they were ready to go. And then in my link oftentimes in my link, I would just write there like what the thing was that I wanted the students to do. So I knew to set that up. So if I wanted them to go off and do their own reading and then in Seesaw share a favorite page and some of the just right words that they thought of and they wanted to share that thinking on that page, then I would write that in there. Like Seesaw, have students share a page. And then last but not least, I would list down like my materials. Like in this instance, I would just want to make sure that I had my book, that I had my anchor chart. And then I would make sure that I had these all prepped ahead of time with my planning sheet, with those Post-it notes. So it was just run seamless. Because again, that recording of it, once you get it going, you want to have those things right there for you so that you're not like searching around. Like I know I am always like, I'm notorious for when running in like a classroom teaching, like I always lose my dry erase marker or my pencil or my pen. Like it always happens, which is fine face to face, because you can like turn around and be like, where's my pen? But when you're recording, like you want to have that stuff right there so that the students aren't distracted by that. And rather they're really focused on the teaching and the demonstrations that you're doing. So that was the setup and the prep end that I found. And so I would just set these up. And I would be like, this session and the date I would put for the date in which I plan to sync that up or link that up for my students to do the viewing and the learning. And then it would be added to my menu. So that was in a remote setting. If I was doing this face-to-face, similarly, I could then just create a bank of these lessons in which students could access from the classroom, whether that was through, their iPads or their Chromebooks or whatever the technology might be in that particular district. And so I would prep, and then I would prep, and then I would prep. And then after I had my prep and my materials ready, then I would know, okay, now I can go into recording. And like I said, oftentimes I would spend one time just doing the prep, and I would spend like a different time in which I would do the recording. So as far as the recording, some tips that I have, there's no right way to do this. I found in talking with many educators, we all kind of have our own way of doing this. But one thing that has worked extremely well for me is I have my document camera at home. And so I got my document camera from Amazon. It's just about $100 document camera. And I can put a couple of links to maybe like a couple that I recommend that I've used that work really well. If you're interested in getting your own document camera, maybe you can use a school budget for a document camera. But my document camera links right up into my laptop. And so that is how I am able to show all of the things underneath my screen. And so I can build anchor charts with students. I can show books. I can show my writing. And then what I'm using to record myself, and so like you can see like the picture of me over here, is I'm using Screencastify. I have heard that most people are using Loom, Screencastify, or Screencast-O-Matic. I went and Googled Screencastify at the beginning of this remote teaching, and I signed up. I tried it out. It was so simple to use that I never tried another one. So I literally just go in, if I'm in, like this is in my Google Chrome, there's a little icon up here, that little arrow, and that's my Screencastify button that was added to my toolbar when I signed up. And then I click that, and I literally just click and select, like I want to use my document, or I want to use my laptop camera, and I want to also show my desktop, and then I hit record, and that's it. And the nice thing about Screencastify is when I stop it, I can, if I want to, I can snip off the beginning or the end. I can link multiple sections together really simply, and they are automatically uploaded into your Google Drive. So if you are sharing links with students through Google Classroom or another digital platform, it makes it super easy to do that. And speaking of that, one last thing, I really made myself stick to one takes. We are not actors or actresses. We have a lot of teaching that we want to be able to get out to students, but We also want to make sure that we're really using our time efficiently so that we have time to interact with our students through conferring and small groups. And so I really, really made myself stick to one takes. Sometimes I didn't like, exactly how I worded something, or another time I read Humpty Dumpty wrong. I mean, I actually have Humpty Dumpty memorized, so I don't even know how I managed to read it wrong, but I did. But I kept it. And I think that's going to be really important if we want to be efficient with the use of our instructional time. And being okay with that, being okay with something happening in the background or noise. I think I had maybe 1 or 2 times where I actually had to completely redo, and it was because I was at home and my dog was barking so loud. I actually tried to continue, but you could not hear me. So, like I said, the one takes are going to be so important. Good is good enough. Get your teaching out there. We do not need to be editing these and making them, look like there's, the next movie trailer. This needs to be something that we can handle, we can add to our plate so that we can be really powerful in our teaching. I hope that you found these tips on creating pre-recorded or flipped mini lessons helpful. Remember, thinking around that why and why we might create these so we get more bang for our buck, no matter if we're teaching face-to-face, remote, or a little bit of both, or all of them at different times throughout the school year. Thinking about how those architecture of the mini lesson components will shift from face-to-face to remote, and thinking about how we want to keep these nice and short and simple. Thinking about how we can prep and get ourselves ready and get into a groove with our recording, and really thinking about prioritizing those one takes. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to see all of you again soon as we put out more tips that are helpful for our classroom teaching.